Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is think. Let's take a look at some definitions or uses for this verb. The first way many people use the verb think is to mean to have a particular opinion, belief, or idea about someone or something. A second way we use the verb think is to mean to use one's mind actively to form connected ideas. So we might think of this verb in describing many times what we're doing in class, trying to connect ideas, maybe think about or anticipate next steps in a variety of subjects. Another way the verb think is used is to mean to expect. So if I said something like, I think I'm going to get a phone call in the next half hour, right? I'm saying I expect to get a phone call in the next half hour. Another way to use the verb think is to call something to mind or remember. So someone asks you a question, and you say, let me think about it, right? So you're actively trying to remember. Think is an irregular verb. To make the progressive tense, all we need to do is add ing to form thinking. The past tense and participle forms of this verb have a completely different spelling. We pronounce this word thought. Thought. Let's continue looking at some additional meanings as we look at think with phrasal verbs. The first phrasal verb I'm going to point out today is to think ahead, and it means to make plans or arrangements for the future. So here's an example of that usage in a sentence. We're already thinking ahead to what we'll do in January and February. Again, this meaning very similar to making plans. Another phrasal verb you might hear is to think back. It means to look back over things that have already happened. Another verb you might hear that has a similar meaning here is reflect. Okay? So let's look at an example of that meaning in a sentence. When I think back on what I did, I feel embarrassed. And so again, someone is remembering a particular thing that was done and now has this feeling of embarrassment. Another phrasal verb you might hear is to think of. It means to consider the possibility of doing something. Here's an example of that. I'm thinking of going to Italy next year. The next set of phrasal verbs we're going to look at are all going to seem a bit similar in meaning. So the first one we'll look at is to think something out. Its meaning is to prepare or plan something fully and carefully. Here's an example of that. He hadn't thought it out properly before starting. So here's an instance where someone didn't plan, someone didn't make preparations before beginning a particular action. Something that will sound a little bit similar is to think something over. When we're doing this, we are considering something very carefully, right? Many times I think of this as thinking all the good things that could happen, all the not so good things that could happen, kind of like, what do I want? Right? So here's an example of think something over. I'm going to think it over before I decide. You might also hear people say, before I make a decision. So again, considering possible outcomes, what could happen. Okay? The next one, again, the meaning here is going to be really similar, is to think something through. It means to consider something carefully with an emphasis on all the possible consequences, right? So I feel like this phrasal verb is something you hear often from parents, maybe even teachers, especially as they're talking to smaller children, and encouraging them to think this through. What bad things could happen if you do this activity. So here's another example of thinking something through. They didn't think it through, and now they have problems. Right? So this will come up in many workplaces and other environments. The last phrasal verb we'll take a look at today is to think up something. This means to invent or create something. Here's an example of that. I thought up an excuse as to why I didn't go. Okay? So again, this has this meaning. I created an excuse to maybe explain why I wasn't in a particular place. Let's continue practicing our verb think today. And instead of looking at a few different verb tenses, let's practice giving advice. And like so many things in English, right, there's more than one way to do this. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 different ways that we can give advice. And all of my sentences will use our verb think. Okay? First, let's look at using should. That's a modal. That is probably the most common way you will hear people give advice. Okay? If I want to make a sentence giving advice with should, all I need is my modal, should, and the base verb. And this is going to be true no matter what my subject is. Okay? Here's an example sentence. She should think through the decision to travel to a state with a high positivity rate. Okay? So here's some advice, again, connected to COVID-19, since that continues to be so present in our lives right now. And we're asking somebody, think about the consequences of going somewhere where there are a number of new cases and their positivity test rate is so high. So should is our first way to give advice. Let's look at negative advice. So now we're telling someone not to do something. If we're doing this with should, again, all we need to do is insert not after that modal. You might hear native speakers use the contraction form, shouldn't. And again, this is going to be the structure no matter what your subject is. So here's another example sentence. You shouldn't think that we are going back to our normal routines anytime soon. I heard a doctor give this advice to people on a news program from the last week. If I want to make a question where I'm asking for advice, I can start with should, then have my subject, and then the base verb. So here's an example question. Should teachers think up new ways to interact with their students online? And I think the answer to this question is yes, many are doing just that. So again, should is the most common way you're going to hear advice given. But there is another way you might hear people use ought to. Okay? And to make a sentence with ought to, we're going to use that structure no matter what our subject is, and then we'll just use the base verb. The thing I should point out here is you might hear native speakers sort of take ought to and combine them, link them into a single word, or blend, some people will say. So it might sound like this, oughta, oughta. You can see my note here kind of on the phonetics of that. So here's an example of ought to with our verb of the day. We ought to think about how the police force is used in our city. Again, this is another comment I've seen used in the last few months as we rethink policing and the bias that exists inherently in our system. You will notice I don't have a negative or a question example, and that's because we don't really use a negative or question format with ought to. So what you can remember today is if you want to ask a question about advice, use should. Okay? I've got one more way for us to look at giving advice. And you might notice across the top of my screen here in the notes, I'm now over in the strong advice area. Okay? So if you want to sort of strengthen the advice you're telling someone, not just, I think this is a good thing for you to do, but you must do this or bad things will happen. The best way to convey that sort of feeling or emotion is to use had, better, and then a base verb. Today, that's think. Okay? So again, we want to use this for very strong advice. Not just like, oh, it's a good idea, but something horrible is going to happen if we don't follow this advice. And this structure, had, better, and the base verb, is the same no matter what your subject is. Let's take a look at an affirmative example. Companies had better think about how workers can socially distance before workers return to the office. Right? We're using that really strong had better here because if companies don't think about this, many of their workers could get very, very sick. If I want to make a negative sentence with had better, to again give that really strong advice, you had better not do this particular action or something bad is going to happen. You can probably see from how I've described this, right? We're going to do had, better, then not, then the base verb. Here's an example sentence. He'd better not think too long about whether to buy the house or someone else will buy it. Right? So there's that consequence. Someone else could buy the house before he does. You'll notice again, there are no questions with had better. So again, if you want to ask a question about advice, use should. Let's take a look now at some words that are related to our verb. The first word should look really familiar to you because it's the irregular past tense and participles form of our verb, thought. But thought can also be a noun. It can have a couple meanings just like our verb. The first meaning is an idea or opinion produced by thinking. Here's an example of that usage in a sentence. Do you have any thoughts about this? Maybe it's a suggestion someone has given or a plan someone has proposed. A second meaning for the noun thought is the action or process of thinking. An example of that usage in a sentence is, the students were deep in thought. Right? So you can almost picture like the wheels spinning in their brain. Another noun you might hear is thinker. It's a person who thinks deeply and seriously. Here's an example of that noun in a sentence. The professor is an independent thinker. The next word we're going to look at is an adjective. It's thoughtful. It can also have a couple different meanings. One meaning is showing consideration for the needs of other people. Here's an example of that usage in a sentence. She received many thoughtful gifts on her birthday. So in this example sentence, friends, family thought about what this particular person really enjoys, maybe what this person really needs as well, and got they were very considerate in how they purchased things for this person. Another meaning for thoughtful is absorbed in or involving thought. Again, it's kind of going back to that process, right? Here's an example of that adjective in a sentence. He had a thoughtful look on his face. Finally, the last word we'll look at today is an adverb. It's thoughtfully. Right? And just like our adjective, it's also going to have similar meanings. We're using this adverb to describe other actions. So one way to use thoughtfully is to mean with consideration for the needs of other people. Here's an example of that. She thoughtfully brought extra masks and hand sanitizer. So consideration of others. I want others to be healthy and well, so I'm going to bring these additional supplies. A second way to use thoughtfully is to mean in a way that suggests being absorbed in thought. Here's an example of that. The audience nodded thoughtfully as he spoke. So we can kind of picture that, right? That people are thinking about what they're hearing. Perhaps they're getting new information. And we can kind of see them nodding their head and going, oh yes, I see how these things connect. Or, oh, that's a new idea. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you'll use the verb think as you write and as you speak this week. Have a great day.